In this video, we are going to take our movie rating app, which used Cloud Firestore, and integrate it into our template that we worked on in the last video, where we got React, Electron, and Electron Forge all set up working together. So for this, we have to make a couple of modifications. So I do have a version of the movie rating app linked from the description here that is updated and ready to go with our current setup. So I recommend downloading this from GitHub, and you could either clone this whole repository or you could download a zip and then just grab from CodeSprint C Week 4 the appropriate app and bring it into your project. Either way, I already have this cloned on my machine, so that's what I'll be using for this setup. Going back to our whiteboard from the previous video, we did creating the React app, adding Electron Forge in the last video. And the last task here is setting up our Electron app to use Firebase, which involves a couple of configurations. So I've kind of split it into a separate video here. So what I'm going to do is open up my project from last time. So in this last video, we set up our application here. We configured our package.json. We set up our deb command to run our React application and run it through Electron. We also have Electron Forge set up so that we can package and make our application. Let me grab the starter files here. So I have downloaded them. I've got the movie rating app starter files. And if we go ahead and open up this package side by side with our current package, we can see that there's some things that we were using under our dependencies here that we don't have under our dependencies here. So we don't have Firebase, we don't have Material UI, we don't have React Router, and we don't have React Helmet over here. There were no dev dependencies in our package.json here, so all we need to do to get this application set up is copy over our files from the starter and make sure that we install all of these dependencies. So I'm going to open up my developer tool, my terminal here, and I am going to npm install, and then I'm going to put these back to back. And to make sure that I don't make any mistakes, I'm just going to copy these in. And Firebase, and React Helmet, and our router. And do one quick check to make sure. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to fire all of those off to install, and while that's running, what I'm going to do, let's close this package.json and pull up the starter files. So what we want to do is grab from the starter all of this like src. This needs to be brought over into our application. We'll also grab our env files, which were how we configured the application to talk to Firebase. So in this version, our app was just the create React app starter. So I can just blow away the src folder, delete it, and then bring in this src folder, making sure to copy the folder, not add it to my workspace. So I've brought over that src, and then let's go ahead and grab the env template and env local. We don't want to copy over our package.json because this version of our application has a bunch of dependencies that other package.json didn't have. And our public folder, there were no changes in this public folder when we were working on our application. So we're going to use the index.html that we modified here in the last video to have the content security policy in it. So we should be good in terms of bringing over the files from our project. You want to make sure that you go into your env.local and fill out your actual Firebase credentials. Put in your API key, your authorization domain, your database URL, etc., so that your application should work. I've already got that set up in my local file. So I'm going to npm run dev. Let's see if it's working. And then we're going to have to make a couple of configuration changes. Whoops, it looks like we got an error. Something is already running on port 3000. And whoops, I had another application on my machine running on port 3000, which is also a good place to point out that like our configuration is a little brittle. We can't have two React applications running simultaneously, and we can't have something on our port 3000 because all of this is set up to expect that. You know, for future versions, we'd want to be able to configure that port so that we wouldn't run into this problem. But I just killed my previous application that was running off screen on port 3000, so this should now boot up. And when this boots up, we'll see the change that we'll have to talk through to get this Firebase application working. All right, so it has booted up. We've got our developer tools opening. What has changed about this application is that the login system needs to be slightly different from what we did in class. We used the Google Authentication to be able to log in with a Google account. Unfortunately, that's a little bit harder to set up in an Electron application. It's not as easy to set up out of the box. So what we're going to do is use a modified version here that has a username and password, where you can create a user or log in a user that already exists. And in terms of changes that happened in the code, if you want to use your own application, the only thing that I have modified in the movie rating app for this version is the account info and account info, or the account info JS and CS files. So you should be able to drop those into your existing application if you want to use your own for following along here. And if we look at the code, do a quick tour, the account info JS here. Whoops, we don't need that console log. We are storing username and password in this account info component now. So when we load our form for letting someone log in, we've got this form here that has an input for the username, has an input for the password that are driving those, or are driven by and are driving those username and password state variables. And then when we actually try to click create user or login user, we're calling the create account or sign in functions. So sign in, we'll take a look at that first. It does the same thing that our sign in did before of clearing errors and starting loading. But then instead of trying to sign in with Google, we're signing in with email and password, and we pass in that username and password. And I have set this up already. You can check the docs, but there are error codes that Firebase will throw when you try to sign in with the wrong username, the wrong password, or an invalid email. So you can see me catching the ones that Firebase provides to us here, and then formatting an error message. And then there's a similar thing for creating an account. Instead of calling sign in with email and password, we're calling create user with email and password. And then down here, we are catching some errors for invalid email, for the email already being used, etc. So that's the modification. It's all here in the account info and account info.css. So you can drop those into your project to bring in this version. You do need to make sure that you go into your Firebase console, you go into your authentication, and that you, under sign-in method, enable email and password here. So edit, flip this on so that folks can log in with email and password. And our Google, I'm going to leave this enabled even though we can't use it in Electron. Or we can't use it in this version of our Electron application. You could build other versions that use it. It just is more complicated to set up. So with this setup, then our Electron application here, you know what, let me bring up my console. Let me delete the test account that I had already created. Let's delete this account. Come back to our application and try signing in with a new account. So I'll use that email address, or you know what, let's delete. Well, it's fine. And give myself a password. I'm going to try an insecure password first, create user, to see that that error is printing out for the password not being secure enough, telling me to put in at least 6 characters. Try doing this and remove the email here. Create user, email is invalid. Please enter a valid email address. And now create user successfully logs in. So I have no movies here, so I could add in a movie. Save it, see it in my movies, go back to my account. I could log out and then log back in and see my account, see that movie that I just added to my account. Let's go ahead and close this down. And one thing that I want to point out is that I think we did this in the last video when we brought in the template. Yes, here we go. So I have disabled the node integration here for our application, which means that in our renderer, in our React application, we can't use node modules. And this is done in part because that's the easiest way to get Firebase modules to play nicely with our setup. But also this is a security thing. So if we disable node integration in that browser window, that means that now, if some malicious code happened to get injected into our website, because we made a mistake in loading like a resource from a bad actor, or someone compromised our GitHub account and injected some code into the application and built a version of the application that folks used, that renderer process can no longer use the node integration. So it can't load the file system, it can't read from the file system, it can't write to the file system. So this is a good security measure. If your application doesn't need any of that node integration in your renderer process, then go ahead and just turn it off and it'll act like a normal browser environment. So this version, we should still be able to run our make command that we set up in the last video, npm run make, which should build our application and then use Forge to set up a installable executable for Windows. So I'm going to pause it while this is running because this takes a minute. All right, and that finished. So we got our Electron folder. So this is our package. And then we also have the make for Windows, which is that installable executable. So let's look at our published project here and point out we're building the compressed version of our application in this ASAR format. This has our env local, env template, our source, our build, our public folder, all packaged inside of it. So everything in here is configured so that our React application will load. So I can test this by double clicking, something that we'll have to fix here. Let's try that again. Debug that in a second, but when we load up this application, we should be able to log in using that account that we just created. See our movies, and we can log back out if we wanted to, and we should now be locked out of those other pages from our router because we set up those protected routes previously. Okay, and let's do some debugging on the fly here. So what we can piece together when we load up this executable is that our application loads fine, no problem, and we can go to specific routes, but whatever it's loading in terms of the router by default is hitting our 404 that says no page exists. So it looks like our router, the initial route that gets loaded here, is not the right route when we load from a file. So this is a good opportunity to try and debug using some of our tools that we already know about. So at this point, we could turn to our debugger or to console logging, and specifically what we want to do is look at our packaged version, because that's where the bug is. When we did it over our local host, no problem. This problem is specifically in our packaged version. So what I would probably do at this point is I would like to know what's happening with the router when things start up. So I would probably go into my app and I'd see, okay, I've got my router here and I've got my switch with the different routes. And when we match a path that isn't one of these, we are ending up at not found. So what I would probably do is go into our not found page and bring in the use location hook. Oops. Const lock equals use location, and you can see that imported up here from React Router DOM, and then I could console log the location to see what is actually happening with our router when the application loads. And to see this, I'm going to have to do an npm run make to get our project building in Electron and loading from the file system so that we can actually see that. So I'm going to run this. I'm going to pause it, demo this sort of debugging process for you. So we'll start back up when this is finished. Okay, so that finished at least the publish stage, and I don't actually need it to make, so I could have run npm run publish there. And if I go load up my Electron application and pop open the developer tools, I should see that location printing out, and we can see there's no hash. The path name is our path to that file there. So it's going into class materials, Electron React resources, app.asir, build index.html. So it thinks that's the path that should be loaded from the router, which doesn't make sense for our router. And actually, now that we can see that this is the path that it's trying to load, that gives us a clue. We can go into our application here. I'm going to get rid of this change that we made. And if I go into my app, instead of using the browser router, which, whoops, let's save this file, which is the router that uses the URL, we can use the memory router. So the memory router does not use the URL passed in. It maintains in its memory, in the browser's memory, the path, the sort of URL for us. So using the memory router here means that that initial path, that file that's loaded, is ignored, and we basically start at the home page with the memory router. Then we should be able to run publish or make and get our new version of our npm run. What did package, not publish. We can run our package or publish here to get our application running with that memory router, which should fix the problem that we were having here. And if you run into more problems as you're working, one of the things that would be useful to do would be to set up a Electron script that runs on the built version of your application. And in fact, you could make it so that you build a non-minified version of your application, so that it's easy for you to load up your application and use the debugger and use the console without having to go through this whole package and make, or I guess in this case it would just be going through our package pipeline, which takes a while. So I'm going to pause while this is running. I'll come back when it's finished. All right, that finished building, so we should be able to go into this folder, open up our executable, and ta-da, it loads our index every time. Because we're using the memory router, it's not actually using the URL bar to load what is actually shown. So at this point, you could continue developing your application within this environment using Electron. One of the cool things that you can do now that this is an Electron environment is maybe you decide you want to rip out Firebase and you want to go with a local solution so that no one has to connect to the internet to use this application. There are a few database options that do this local version of a database. So you could go check out something like AnyDB, DB, which is a JavaScript database. It's 100% JavaScript, but it is also set up so that you can save your database to a file as opposed to save it in memory. So if you're in this Electron environment, you can actually save that database and use this database as your source of the user information. Now you don't need an account anymore. You just load up whatever's in this database. The user can add and edit things locally without ever needing an external service like Firebase. So there's some cool options for you if you want to get rid of Firebase and use a different database solution here with Electron. If you want to keep going with Firebase, I'll make sure that this article is linked in the description, but it describes some of the challenges and tips and tricks for setting up your application to use Firebase and Electron together, and talks about the main process, the renderer process. We've kind of gone with this route of making sure that there's no node in the renderer process, which sets up Firebase to work quite nicely because the Firebase module thinks it's running in the browser. And there are a couple sort of caveats that are mentioned here, like the signing in with pop-up and signing in with redirect aren't going to work outside of the box. That's why we switched over to a username and password. To set those up, you'll have to go through a bit more of a process, but it's not impossible if you want to go that route. Okay, so let's back up. Let's review some of the steps we did to kind of finish off this video. So what we did was we sort of blew away the source folder and put in our own React application here, which was the one we were working in class with Firebase here to have our data store, which required us to bring over our env local and env template to get everything working. We installed our dependencies into this. So we brought in our Material UI, Firebase, the router, Helmet into this project, and then just dropped in our new login system to replace our Google login system. And then we were off to the races, building our application, but packaging it up so that it is an executable. So at this point, you should have a template for working with Firebase, Electron React, and Electron Forge all together.